Good evening. Welcome to Expressions, the platform where we discuss current relevant news issues of economics and politics. Today, our special guest is Dr. Bibek Debroy, Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and a man of many talents, right from his knowledge of epics to his knowledge of chess. Today's focus will be, of course, economics. Prabhu Chawla, Director Editorial for New Indian Express. Welcome to the show, Bibek.
Thank you.
So, one of the aspects that has been happening is that there is a noise. This, as Keynes said, that there's a lot of noise and very little signal in the what's happening in the economy. So it's good to have you here to get some clarity on what's happening. The IMF's new forecast estimate, or what you and I have often joked about, stare at the ceiling estimate, has come. At the economy is supposed to be shrinking at 10% this year. But from your standpoint, what does it look like? We are now in the 7 months after the lockdown, 3 months after the lifting of the lockdown. From your standpoint, what does the economy look like?
Well, thank you, Shankar. And there are several ways I can answer this question. One way this question is to say that, look, we are in the midst, we meaning not just in India, every country in the world, an unprecedented health crisis in the form of COVID, and we don't really know when it will end, when it will taper off. We still do not know whether there will be a vaccine or not. Ostensibly, we might think that we're in the middle of unlockdown, but let us also accept and realize that many of the lockdown decisions are not decisions by the union government. The union government only has a template in terms of minimum guidelines. Many other lockdown decisions are taken by state governments and even local bodies. So therefore, COVID has not only meant a health crisis, it has also led to a slackening of economic activity. Most economic activity in terms of contribution to national income occurs in urban areas, semi-urban areas. It occurs in the form of trade, transportation, services, construction, and all of those have been hit by COVID and the resultant lockdown, and that is not yet over. Purely in terms of GDP numbers, Q1 of this year was the worst. Q2, when the figures, and quite often we react instantaneously to quarterly figures, and the quarterly figures are always, at least in newspapers, year on year. So they're a function of what they were last year, what was Q1 last year. So Q1 of this year was the worst. I think Q2 of this year will be better. It will still be negative. From Q3, we will move into positive territory, and Q4 have a little bit more of positive. So this financial year, I think we will end with a negative real GDP rate of growth. How much is that going to be? Anywhere between 7%, 10% or thereabouts. So if someone says 7%, I'd say possible. Someone says 10%, that's also possible. No one knows for sure, because these are all projections on the basis of not entirely the ceiling method, but on the basis of imperfect information, because the information often trickles in with a time lag of about 3 months. From next financial year, we will move into positive real growth trajectory. Real growth being negative this year means that nominal rate of growth will also be pretty close to zero, not outright negative. which means it has revenue implications for union government and state government. So that's where we are.
So one of the critical aspects for recovery or revival or restarting the economy is where we are in terms of the pandemic itself, in terms of the infections. And you and I have discussed this about how lockdowns shift the curve to the right, or rather, instead of flattening, they shift the infection to the right. I mean, we've gone through various iterations of how lockdowns must be done, and different state governments have different thinking on this. What is the one gap that you see in the management of the pandemic itself? Given, I mean, we accept all the constraints that we have in terms of the healthcare services and all, but we have had a sustained number over over the last few weeks, even though it's no longer near the 100,000 number that we had seen in between, or the 90,000 number. But many states, and there are new areas. So if you were to put your finger on the one thing that state governments are sort of failing at or flailing at, what would be that?
You're asking that question particularly in terms of the health response.
Yeah, in terms of how the public policy response has been.
Quite often we react. There's a lot of panic associated with COVID. The fact of the matter is that the death rates are low. They are low as a share of infections. They are low as they're even lower as a share or as a percentage of total population. So compared to other countries in the world, the fatalities are low. What is even more important is that the fatalities over a period of time have eased, meaning the figures have dropped a little bit. We are nowhere near any conceivable definition of herd immunity. So I have a feeling the infections will continue for some time before they begin to taper off. The question to ask is not about what about infections, because many infections for most people are going to be either without symptoms or they are going to be without serious consequences. So the objective has to be to concentrate on the serious cases so that the fatality rates can decline. And as I just said, the fatality rates have been declining. You are absolutely right that any lockdown simply shifts the curve to the right. It does not eliminate the disease. So what does shifting that curve to the right help us do? It helps us to get our systems together, to plan, to handle the serious cases better. And I think what this has demonstrated, what this entire episode has demonstrated, is that some states are better at governance, regardless of what we are talking about, not just COVID, than others. And some states are not that good. I said states, but quite often in the case of something like COVID, it boils down to municipal government. It boils down to districts and municipal governments. And irrespective of which state, there are districts and municipal governments which have done extremely well in terms of testing, proper testing, in terms of contact tracing, in terms of handling serious cases, and there are other states which have not. So it flags the perennial issue that you and I have talked about and written about for a very, very long time, that there is a governance issue. That governance issue is not just union government, it's not even state government, it's local government.
Yeah, and one of the surprising things, and the New Indian Express is published in many centers in Kerala. One of the surprising things is that in the initial days, Kerala came in for a lot of praise on how it handled the pandemic, and now it is sort of being criticized, or people are surprised that the number of cases are rising there. And so I don't know whether it's a function of the mobility of the population, is a function of more people coming from outside, or they have not sort of figured out the more relaxed lockdown norms. What do you think explains the sudden turnaround, or the
I think there are two issues. Firstly, as there is better testing, the numbers will go up. And I'm talking really about the RT-PCR. I'm not talking about the rapid antigen, which can sometimes give false negatives also. So as there is better testing, the numbers are expected to go up, and across states there is a correlation between better testing, and we are still not testing enough, and number of infections. Having said that, if I take two extremes, one is a complete lockdown, which is bad for economic activity, bad for livelihood. And we look at the other extreme, which is a sufficient amount of discipline among citizens in terms of social distancing, wearing masks. Until we have a vaccine, and I'm extremely skeptical about what a vaccine will really do, until we have a vaccine, the only solution, if we don't want a lockdown, is for that social distancing to happen. People wearing masks, behaving in responsible fashion. And across states, we have seen that as unlockdown started, it is not simply a case of livelihood and economic livelihood, but as unlockdown started, citizens who should have known better have not observed the norms. And whenever those norms have not been observed, it's perfectly understandable that the contagion should spread. So no one desires a strict lockdown because it's bad for the economy, but what that simultaneously also entails, that as citizens we need to have the appropriate discipline.
Doctor, I will come back here on you, because social distancing and economics, there's a relationship between the two. Because you can see what is happening. IPL matches are being held in Dubai. They could have been held in India also. Economic situation would have been a little better. We would have got $100 million extra in the Indian economy. People are moving out to hold matches in UAE rather than holding in Chennai and Cochin. They are maintaining the social distancing. Why they went there? But social distancing, also what you earlier put it, fear of pandemic is creating much more reluctance on the part of the people to go out and work. How do you remove that fear of unknown?
No, I think the fear is caused by two or three different factors. Firstly, there is always fear of the unknown, and this is an unknown. The chance of dying from COVID, unless I have a comorbidity, unless I'm old, the chances of dying from COVID are lower than the chances from dying from a road accident. But the point, of course, is that I don't really know what that probability is, because initially the fatality rates were higher. More importantly, I do not know what is going to happen to me if I am one of those seriously infected patients, because there are horror stories doing the rounds, particularly in this age of WhatsApp and Twitter, of cases where the patient has suffered, where the patient's family has suffered, because of testing, often by private labs, which were deficient, often by treatment on the part of private hospitals, which were deficient, often by a confusion in terms of state governments adhering to the template of where someone who's COVID positive can be treated. Many of the initial problems which were associated with PPEs and things like that, ventilators, those have eased. but we still do have a very serious problem with health personnel. I'm not just talking about doctors, but also paramedics. And it is because of this uncertainty, I think, that there is this large degree of panic.
Vivek, I'll intervene you with here. India had the stringest lockdown in the world in the initial places. When there was only one case, we had a lockdown of the worst kind. But during the lockdown, are you sure that we were able to create enough infrastructure, sensitivity, awareness, so that we could have prevented this kind of large lockdown for 7 months and adversely affecting the economy? Number two, what you are talking about old people, the figure which has come today, which I've seen in the newspaper, largest number of people who have died because of COVID is between the age of 30 to 50, not the older one. That is a worrying point, because they're the economic creators, wealth creators, who are working actively in the field, and they are dying of COVID more often. There is some problem, some kind of a problem in how to deal with the young population who are getting it. Don't you think lockdown was not in a position to create the infrastructure, awareness, or whatever you wanted to prevent the maximum, to minimize the impact of COVID?
Well, you've asked two questions, so let me respond to those one by one. Let us cast our minds back to March. And when anyone is taking a decision, one is taking a decision in the absence of perfect information. With perfect information, and information is imperfect even now, there may or may not be better decision making. It remains counterfactual. In March, there were models, and these models were forecasting COVID infections for India of 700 million, and they were projecting 30 million deaths. And those projections by more than one person were all over the media, were being cited by medical professionals. So in terms of a government's decision, given all of this evidence, so-called evidence and so-called modeling that was coming from the medical fraternity, it was very difficult to resist a lockdown, knowing fully well the consequences of that on economic activity. Because as a counterfactual, if the number of deaths had shot up to about 5 million, it would have been the government which would have been culpable.
Okay, you completely. Okay, sorry.
The fact of the matter is that the number of deaths in India compared to what was being projected is just around 100,000 now, 1 lakh. Now, this is a counterfactual, so one can never establish anything one way or the other. I'm just underlying what all of these models said in March. The second point you made is about the young. Now, sometimes the young also have comorbidities. I'm not talking about diabetes, but certainly heart disease has not spared the young either. If one were to generalize, I'm inclined to think, and it is indeed true, that compared to many other countries, it is the young who are dying in India. But one must be a little bit careful. One needs to be a little bit careful in making cross-country comparisons, because the life expectancy in other countries is much higher. So it is perfectly understandable that the people who are dying in other countries on an average would be older than those dying in India. Having said that, I all think, partly anecdotal, because it is very difficult to establish this statistically, I think the young are a little bit more careless about the social distancing and the masks. But this is purely
Doctor, I'm a journalist, so I'm very pessimistic and inquisitive because you said in the beginning, in the absence of any information, you are dependent on models which came, I don't know, do you know the source of the model on which the medical practitioner in India or abroad suggested that we will be having 700 million people infected with COVID? It means our government and everybody was being guided by elements whose credibility was maybe in doubt. There might be some kind of a conspiracy to stop Indian economy from going. I can look the other way, which may be a very laughable solution, but I'm talking by stopping the economy, Indian economy, there must be forces working to stop us from getting into full economic activity or going slowly into imposition of curbs. Why you trust people whose predictions have always been wrong? Whether they are rating agencies, whether WHO, whether anybody else, why the government depends on such kind of predictions?
I say anything about the government depending on such kind of predictions, not quite. You see, the conspiracy theory I will not react to. Anyone who does a model has a model which needs to be populated with data. Predicted this is only later when better data came along that one realized that the use of those variables from other countries was not particularly appropriate for a country like India. In a situation of uncertainty, all I'm saying is the risks of any government not doing anything like a lockdown would have been too high. And even a country like Sweden, that was cited earlier as a country which did not introduce a lockdown, is now being criticized in terms that has not been faced by the world since 1980. So therefore, because lives are precious, every government tends to be risk averse in terms of the draconian lockdown that is imposed.
Bibek, coming to, I mean, there is a trade-off between how you manage lives and how you manage livelihood, and that's really the challenge. Where we are in the economy now, there are questions about what the government has been doing, what needs to be done. A large section of the commentary sort of suggests that we have not done enough in terms of stimulus to create demand. And there is also a lot of applause and appreciation for the structural reforms that have come through, particularly labor, the decisions to free agricultural markets. And all of this are interesting points. But on the issue of creating demand on foreign consumption, which is what is the original thesis on stimulus, do you feel that the government has done adequately? Or is there a logic to the incrementalism that has been followed in the spurring of demand? I understand that there is some correlation between how much of the economy is open and how much of stimulus will work, the multiplier effect. But what's your overall sense?
Well, before I answer that question, let's go back a little bit to a question you started off with. I said that next year we will be back in positive territory so far as the real rate of growth is concerned. There is a rate of growth and there is a level. Next year, the real rate of growth will be positive. Part of it will be statistical because this year was bad. And for next year, year on year, quarter on quarter will seem to be better. A better way of answering the question is to accept that as a result of COVID, we have essentially lost 2 years in that path and trajectory of development. We have effectively lost 2019-20, and we will also lose 2020-21 because that's a recovery from what we lost this year. So we are back to actual growth from 2022-23. So one way to ask that question is from 2022 to 23, what kind of real rate of growth can we expect? And what do we want the government to do in the process?
Absolutely, absolutely.
In terms of national income accounting, there can be only four sources of growth. One is net exports, and the other three are consumption, investment, and government expenditure. Net exports in this day and age, given what has been happening globally, cannot possibly be a major growth driver. So one is looking at consumption, investment, and government expenditure. When one talks about fiscal policy, a fiscal policy part can either have an expenditure element or it can have a tax reduction element. One or the other. Either you increase government expenditure or you reduce taxes. One must realize that the government is not in very good fiscal shape, and any borrowing that the government does will eventually have to be repaid. So if the nominal rate of growth is lower than the rate at which the government is borrowing, then one has a serious problem in terms of servicing that debt. And this is not because of rating agencies, otherwise Mr. Chawla will again mention that. This is simply because of the issue that you cannot service the debt. So therefore, if I look at what other countries have done and look at it in terms of this is the extra fiscal expenditure as a share of GDP, why can't India do that? That's not a tenable proposition because India is not in the same kind of fiscal situation as the other countries. The next question that arises is quite often when people say the government should do something, what they really mean is that taxes should be reduced. I need to point out that on indirect taxes, the revenue neutral GST rate, should have been at least 17% to give the same kind of revenue. What is the GST rate today? The average one is 11.5%. Given this, does one seriously expect the GST rates to be reduced even further? How can we possibly, as a country, want airports, railway stations, defense, this, that, and the other, education, health, all of this, while we want taxes to be reduced? Any proper GST reform will actually involve an increase in the effective rate. Exactly similarly, on the direct tax side, any possible tax reform will involve the removal of exemptions. For many cases, that will involve an actual increase in the tax rate. Now, I'm mentioning this because expectations of a tax reduction and that being used to establish fiscal policy, I think is wrong. That expectation is wrong. Also, in addition, any economics textbook will point out that the effects of a government expenditure multiplier, and you use the word multiplier, the effects of a government expenditure multiplier are far superior to those of a tax reduction multiplier. So it now boils down in government expenditure. Remember that union government finances are already strained. There is extra expenditure on health grounds, on emergency grounds. There is extra expenditure in terms of GST compensations to states. There is something that one must hold on to in case COVID deteriorates. There is something one must hold on to in case there is a vaccine and that vaccine has to be funded. More importantly, if there is going to be greater government expenditure, the timing has to be right. The sequencing has to be right. In terms of elementary economics, this is a demand curve and a supply curve. If the supply curve is inelastic, a shift in the demand curve to the right, which is what fiscal policy means, achieves nothing. All it does is it results in an increase in prices. So, expansion in fiscal policy has to be timed when the economy is beyond the lockdown. I need not get into what the government has already done in terms of the supply side measures, which you have mentioned as structural reforms, which will begin to take hold from, I think, with the timeline of 2023. Nor I need to mention infrastructure expansion, the infrastructure expenditure, some of it because of fiscal reasons has been leveraging money instead of outright expenditure. The finance minister is on record as saying that there will be an additional package, and I would interpret that as saying the timing and the sequencing of that will have to be right, so that it works. By the way, I should quickly mention that quite a lot has already gone into the noodles.
Doctor, I'll intervene here because I'm by education, I'm an economist, but I don't apply these economic jargon of expenditure, deficit, financing, fiscal policy. I'm interested in one thing: the stimulus, which is Shankar started in the beginning. We have forgotten about that. So many stimulus packages have been announced so far, including 5,000 rupees has gone to the farmer hand. But why demand has not picked up so far? Why is the government afraid of deficit financing? Why can't you use the Reserve Bank of India like Trump is giving cash money in the hands of the people? So is Johnson giving in England? Why our economists are following the IMF model which they don't apply on their own country? In India, okay, if we cross 3%, we will be dead. We have to revive the demand. For reviving the demand, you have issued something like LTC. I recommend the Padma Bhushan for the person who wrote the LDC package, that you must buy a product which gives you 12% GST. You must buy a product, spend 3 times more than what you are getting. If that is the way you create stimulus, God should save this country. But what have you done so far in the government, as the state government? You are forcing the state government to buy to meet the deficit of GST. You don't want to borrow yourself because you believe in the IMF government foreign model of running the economy. You don't develop your own Indian model of handling the expenditure. We have learned in the past, our fathers used to tell that you must spend according to your income. But here you have to create in terms of why you are sticking to the deficit level of 3%. What is so secret about it? If you cross the barrier, print more currency, what difference does it make?
I said that I will ignore that bit about Padma Bhushan because Prabhu Chawla's recommendations of Padma Bhushan are likely to be much more effective than mine. So let's ignore that. Let's talk about the question. As I said earlier, deficit financing has its costs. It is not costless. The fiscal deficit is not a fetish. The reason, regardless of the IMF, and the IMF hasn't said anything in terms of advice to India now, as I said, the debt has to be repaid. Let me also remind you that at the end of October, the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission will be submitted to the government. And the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission are not yet known. Recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission will involve a certain amount of fiscal devolution to states. The government, the union government, has to retain the cushion for meeting the recommendations of the Union Finance Commission, which may be not only in terms of division of the divisible pool of taxes, but in addition, beyond the formula, grants in aid. There has to be some stock taking, Finance Commission, independent of the Finance Commission, of central sector and centrally sponsored schemes. Central sector and centrally sponsored schemes are often in the social sectors, and the social sectors assume even greater importance in the context of a crisis like this, which is fundamentally a human crisis. If one is looking at an ability to repay debt, to my mind, and this is purely my way of thinking, another 2% of GDP fiscal leeway is only what is available. I defy anyone to establish for me a credible medium-term fiscal strategy which involves incremental expenditure of more than 2% of GDP. I challenge anyone to demonstrate a fiscally sustainable projection for me. Out of this 2% of GDP, remember what I said about GST compensation? Remember what I said about the Finance Commission? Remember what I said about the vaccine? Remember what I said about emergency measures, etc., etc.? I think out of the 2% of GDP, 1% of GDP just gets swallowed up. So you've got 1% of GDP left. And I will reiterate what I said earlier, that 1% of GDP has to be timed, that expenditure has to be timed so that it does not merely lead to inflation. One of the remarkable successes of this government, and by this government I mean since 2015, has been the control of inflation. We have been down that monetization path in the past. We may have forgotten that. We have been down that monetization path, and we have had rates of inflation of 8%, 9%, 10%, even 12%. And let me point out that people who are journalists, not editors, may be very happy with nominal increments of 12% and feel very unhappy if the nominal increments are 5%, not realizing that that 12% nominal increment happened against an inflation rate of 12%, and that 5% nominal increment is happening against an inflation rate of 3%, so that in real terms, that increment of 5% is better. However, what needs to be remembered is inflation is a regressive tax. It hurts the poor much more than it does the rich. So therefore, in excess of that 1% of GDP, which I think is what is possible, any further argument in favor of deficit financing, I think I would suggest to some people, do not look at the IMF, do not look at other countries, look at the track record of what happened in India since the 1980s. Do remember that this automatic demonetization, when it was stopped in the second half of the 90s, it took a lot of persuasion. It took a lot of political capital. Something that was accomplished with a lot of effort. I certainly would not personally advocate giving that up. So far as my advice is concerned, Shankar, you asked me a question, and I'm going to avoid answering it. I'm going to say outright no, because my advice, I'm an advisor to the PM. I'm not an advisor to the world at large. I'm not an advisor to the Morning Standard. I may be to the New Indian Express. So therefore, whatever as a council we have recommended to the Prime Minister shall be restricted for the eyes of the Prime Minister.
Vivek, I'll go back to the main question, deficit financing, because I don't want to get into an argument, because as an economist, I can't argue with you. As an economist student, I've heard there are 6 economists, 7 opinions. So you may differ at every point of view. Basic question, which again I'm asking, despite so many stimuluses, I'm part of the industry, which is the barometer of the economic expansion. we are the worst victim of what has happened in the past 7 months. Revenues are down by 70-80% of every newspaper in the country and everywhere else. So when we are not able, it means the people who are supposed to spur demand and sell, they don't have money to advertise their products with us. How do you expect 2 years later you will have, not only you will be able to neutralize 10% contraction, which you are admitting may happen or may not happen. 10% contraction year after year, it means by 2021, you will be able to recover 10% plus you will go positive. That is what you said. For that, what is the magic wand you have got in your hand that you will reverse 10% contraction in the next 12 months and become a positive? So it has to happen. Either demand only can do it. But as a media person, we know our pages are shrinking. Whenever the pages of a newspaper anywhere in the world shrinks, that reflects the economy is not picking up. That is one way of looking at it.
Let us not quibble about this. Firstly, I will repeat what I said earlier. Just as one should not overreact to the 10% reduction this year, one should not overreact to the 10% increase next year. Both of these are statistical because they are year on year. One should not overreact to either of those, just as one should not overreact to the 23% contraction in Q1. Q1 of next year will also have a fantastic positive, but that's not the point. I will also not get into the issue of whether the newspaper industry in the print medium is the right instrument to use as an indicator, because the print industry has been facing threats from other sectors. For example,
okay, doctor, I'll correct again. I'll correct. Expenditure on advertising across media, electronic, internet is down by 65%. Now you complete.
Let me complete my statement. I will not advocate any intervention by government which is sectoral in nature. Any intervention by government which is sectoral in nature, and I'm saying this not because you have said it, there are other newspaper editors who have lobbied for a reduction specifically for the newspaper sector. That's why I'm saying this. I would not advocate any sectoral intervention, because all sectoral interventions distort the tax structure and make the tax reforms even more difficult. What the evidence shows, and here I'm talking about evidence, is that certain segments of society, it is no longer the case, and this is not robust evidence, because as I said, robust evidence emanates with a time lag. Certain segments of society now, after the initial lockdown period was over, they do have the money. It's not that the money does not exist, the money exists. It is that that money is not being spent. Now, this is an important distinction I'm making. The fragmentary evidence suggests that it is no longer the case that people don't have money. Obviously, there will always be some people who don't have money, because people who are on contractual jobs or semi-contractual jobs have now got jobs at 1/2 of the salary that they used to be paid earlier. But there are also simultaneously significant sections which have the money but are now not spending. So the policy intervention should be in terms of ensuring that consumer expenditure takes place. One reason why people are not spending is people do not spend whenever there is uncertainty. So whenever there is uncertainty, people normally are reluctant to spend. So if I am not sure that I will have a job next year, I will not spend. If I have a reasonable degree of certainty that I will have a job for the next 3 years, I will then begin to spend, because some of this expenditure is discretionary expenditure. We are talking about discretionary expenditure. We are not talking about food, clothing, and stuff like that. So the government intervention, we go back to consumption, investment, government expenditure. Many of those intervention, supply side that you called, are in the nature of stimulating investment expenditure. Consumption expenditure, I think the best thing any government can do is to remove the uncertainty, which means remove the uncertainty about taxation, remove the uncertainty about employment prospects. Now, the government, any government, reacts continuously. Just because the government has done X, Y, Z does not mean the government will not do A, B, C. So therefore, I would suggest that let us wait to see what further announcements will be made, because as the finance minister herself has said, this is not the last of the policy statements that will happen.
I think that we shall draw upon Bibek's extraordinary knowledge of the epics and the classics, and ask him if there is a particular verse that he could quote, which sort of sums up the discussion and and sort of tells people to hold on to hope.
I will not quote a specific verse, but I will say section of Bharat, which is known as the Shanti Parva, where Bhishma is lying down on his bed of arrows and is instructing Yudhishthira. There are 3 subsections in Shanti Parva. The first of these subsections is called Raja Dharma, about what the king or the government should do. What is dharma for the king or the government? Raja Dharma. But the next section of Shanti Parva is called Apat Dharma, which is dharma in the time of calamities. When there is a calamity, you deviate from the normal template of dharma, whether it is the government, whether it is the individual. We are unfortunately in the middle of an Apat Dharma. There is uncertainty not only for the likes of Prabhu Chawla and Shankarayar and Bibek Debroy, there is uncertainty also on the part of the government. And because lives are precious, they're much more important than livelihoods in some sense, not that there's a trade-off. Governments have to be cautious. So let us be patient and wait, because one great difference between living in India and living in Canada is that living in India, you learn to be patient.
India is much more patient and resilient, from the historical point of view.
I hope it's an occasion to sort of look up the particular segment of Mahabharata and read up on Shanti Parva one more time. Thanks, Bibek. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Bibek. Thank you.
Bye.